Hello, my name's Neville Morley. I'm Professor of Ancient History at the University of Bristol in the UK, and I'm currently directing a project called Thucydides, Reception, Reinterpretation and Influence. And that's what I'm going to be talking about now, under the general title Thucydides in the Modern World, or, as you could also put it, the modern reception of Thucydides. Now, in studying the modern reception of Thucydides, we are not really focused on what you might call the real Thucydides, what Thucydides actually intended to write, what his text was really all about. Rather, what we're interested in are the different ways in which Thucydides has been read, in which this pioneering work of ancient Greek history has been interpreted by later readers from the 15th century onwards, and the different ways in which they have made use of this text. Now, reception theory, I use the term reception theory is the way in which many scholars consider this afterlife of texts. It focuses on the way that readers make sense of texts, or sometimes of artistic objects, the way in which they interpret texts, reinterpret them, and also, I suppose, what they then do with them, how they make use of their understanding of the work that they've been reading. One of the key ideas in reception theory is that meaning is realised at the point of reception. In other words, what the author really meant, what the original meaning of his text was, is actually less important than what the reader makes of it, how that text is understood in a later century, in a different historical context. Now, this means, for example, how Shakespeare made sense of stories about the ancient world, how John Milton or Goethe looked to classical poems, classical literary models, and made use of them in their own work, and so forth. Now, generally speaking, reception theory, classical reception theory, has concentrated on literary texts, on poems, plays, and so forth, and on artistic receptions, the way that people have looked, say, to classical sculpture. When considering the reception of Thucydides, arguably things are slightly different. Above all, there's an emphasis, with almost all readings of Thucydides, on reality and on factuality. That is to say, almost every reader wants to insist that his or her reading is the correct one, that this is what Thucydides really meant. Whereas modern readers of Homer, for example, are quite often very happy to say, I'll take Homer as a starting point, I'll develop my own interpretation, I'll develop my own version of Homer, and almost it doesn't matter so much to them whether or not this is the real Homer. In the case of Thucydides, perhaps because he presents himself as a historian who is closely focused on the reality of the world and understanding how things really were, in the case of Thucydides, modern readers have almost always insisted that their understanding of Thucydides, their reception, is what is really going on, what the text really means. And that makes a difference to their understanding. As scholars, I think we can very easily see how it's their reading. It's a reading that is of its time. It's a reading that shows the influence of the particular ideas, cultural context, and so forth. But the readers themselves insist that it's not their Thucydides, so to speak, it is the Thucydides that they find and present in their accounts. It's also worth emphasising that the reception of Thucydides is not limited to the text. there's a great emphasis on the idea of Thucydides himself, on different readers' impressions of what Thucydides was like, what were his personal qualities. So very often, readers of Thucydides develop their interpretation on the basis of an idea of what kind of writer Thucydides was like and what his character was. Indeed, there's a tradition of the reception of Thucydides which is really not connected to his text at all. There's a general, one might almost say, sort of fuzzy cultural notion of Thucydides as the rigorous, reality-focused, realist historian, which doesn't necessarily involve his actual text, what he actually wrote. It's derived from it at some distant remove. The idea of Thucydides was, once upon a time, an idea which was drawn from reading his history. But especially today, where we find Thucydides regularly quoted on the internet and mentioned by politicians and so forth, most of those people have not read Thucydides. They are responding to a very powerful idea of what Thucydides stands for. And that idea can then influence how other people read the text. So it's never a pure response to what Thucydides wrote. It's always mediated through broader cultural conceptions of what Thucydides means in the modern world. Now, there are all sorts of questions about why this is. One can certainly argue that Thucydides' text is particularly, if not uniquely, open to a variety of interpretations, that Thucydides wrote, or appears to have written, a text that is deliberately open and ambiguous. It's supposed to set up debates and discussions. It's supposed to be uncertain what the significant message is, because Thucydides wants us to think about it, to argue about it. That is the point. This is a text which sets up problems rather than provides answers. But of course, that is simply my interpretation. That's the idea I get when I read Thucydides. Other writers have looked to Thucydides and felt that there is a clear message, and that is what Thucydides meant to do. Now, it's interesting that Thucydides' text is able to be interpreted in these different ways, even to the point that actually there is uncertainty about what we should call it. What kind of a text is this? What kind of generic category does this belong to? Certainly, this is one of the important factors in understanding how Thucydides has been read and interpreted and reinterpreted over the last few centuries. Thucydides in the modern world is not a simple subject. One of the most significant consequences of this is there is not a single tradition of how Thucydides is read. We can't simply trace the way that one writer read him and another writer then responded. Rather, there are quite different traditions of reading Thucydides. There are different national traditions, so Thucydides tends to look rather different in Germany from the way that he looks in France, and certainly very different from the way that he looks in the United States. There are also very different traditions, as I've hinted, of reading him in disciplinary terms, of saying, for example, that this is a work of history, and so historians tend to focus on Thucydides. But at the same time, actually there are other writers who see Thucydides as basically a political analyst. There is an entirely separate tradition of reading Thucydides in those terms, and therefore of understanding the nature of his text in completely different terms. And I want to talk about a couple of the most important strands of interpretation. Sometimes these are separate, very often they interact, and different ideas of Thucydides come into contact with one another. Now, the first of these is probably the most obvious. Most people who know something about Thucydides will think of him as a historian, and so it's quite natural that there has been a tradition of reading Thucydides as a historian, understanding his text as a historical text. In other words, as something that is at least partially the same as what we understand today as history. Now, Thucydides as a historical writer was never particularly popular before the 18th century. Compared with, say, Tacitus or Livy or Plutarch, Thucydides was never prominent. He's not very widely cited or mentioned. There are far fewer translations and editions of Thucydides than there are for very many other ancient historians. There are all sorts of different arguments about why this should be. How far is it because his Greek is difficult? And certainly that's why Thucydides is not known in Europe, or certainly is not known in any depth, before the 15th century. How far is it because Thucydides' ideas are difficult? Or more, that they don't fit with the prevailing notion of what history is about. There is a conventional idea that up until the late 18th century, what people look for in history are examples, exempla, moral lessons that tell you how you should live, what you should do. Nice, straightforward historical lessons for statesmen and aristocrats. Plutarch clearly is a really good source of that sort of material. Thucydides is a fairly terrible source. So, for the most part, Thucydides is read in these earlier centuries by only a few people, and mainly they're interested in his speeches, taking parts of Thucydides as models for rhetoric, rather than thinking of Thucydides as a historical thinker. As I said, it's from the late 18th century that Thucydides as historian becomes important and prominent, and more people start to focus on him as, in some cases, the most important ancient historian, but certainly as a particularly important ancient historian. But it has to be said that even in this period, Thucydides as a historian is understood in different ways. There are different ideas about what kind of a historian he is, and about what we should do with his historical text. Partly, this reflects different ideas about what history is. Partly, Thucydides becomes a place where different historians can argue about what history is, or what history should be. So, for example, Thucydides is very often seen simply as a reliable source of data about the past. This is the way that someone like George Grote, the great early 19th century British historian of classical Greece, this is the way that Grote reads him. Basically, Grote's history of this period of the 5th century in Athens and in the rest of Greece is more or less a paraphrase of Thucydides. He trusts Thucydides almost completely. He simply reproduces the data that he finds in Thucydides' work. So there's an idea of Thucydides as an objective, reliable historian, as someone whose account can be trusted. But someone like Grote doesn't spend much time worrying about that. He just takes it for granted. Thucydides is great, so we can just use the information that he gives us about the past. Now that's one quite conventional approach, but there are others. There is the idea that Thucydides should be taken as a model of theory and practice, that Thucydides tells us how we should do history. Thucydides is seen to be the first who develops a proper idea of critical method. He analyses the sources. He doesn't just accept the traditions that have been handed down. Thucydides offers, at the beginning of Book 1, methodological precepts. He offers an idea of why history is important, that why we should study it at all, and he then offers this wonderful model of a compelling history. So all sorts of different ideas as to what Thucydides might teach us are drawn out of the text. They're not consistent ideas. There's no unanimity in this. There are lots and lots of debates in the 19th century about what we should learn from Thucydides. What do we do with the speeches? Are the speeches a model of how historians must be creative artists, which is how they're understood by some people? Or are the speeches a problem that undermine Thucydides' claim to be a proper objective historian? And then the mirror image of this notion that Thucydides in some way, not necessarily in the same way, but Thucydides in some way is the model historian, there is also the idea that Thucydides is actually a negative model, that Thucydides gives us the wrong sort of history. Now that can be that he is too artistic. Thucydides is too much like the old notion of history as art rather than history as science. But there are also debates about what kind of history Thucydides does. He focuses on politics and battles. For some historians, that's absolutely wrong. What they want to argue is the proper approach to history is a much broader history, sort of cultural, social, economic history and so forth. Sometimes they then look to Herodotus as a better model, but mainly they look to Thucydides as an image of how historians can get it wrong, and indeed a rather worrying image, because the power of Thucydides, the notion that he is this great original historian, means that people then think that his history is the correct sort. And if you're an economic and social historian, then actually that's a problem. Thucydides is almost your enemy. Thucydides is the great symbol of the history that you don't think should be so popular. Now, in all of these debates, there are different ways of thinking about Thucydides. Sometimes he's seen as basically a modern historian, as someone who is somehow anticipating modern history long before the modern period. In other words, Thucydides is basically like us. An awful lot of 19th century historians recognise themselves in Thucydides. They recognise Thucydides as basically a colleague, indeed someone who is taking the sort of history that they want to practice and has already developed it to a high level. So the notion of Thucydides as the perfectly critical historian, the scientific historian, is really quite widespread. And there's then a question of how was it that he was able to achieve this in the 5th century when, in the 19th century, historians are still struggling against older conceptions of history. Now, of course, to understand Thucydides as a modern historian, you have to ignore all sorts of aspects of his work. You have to ignore his speeches, for example, because they don't fit with the modern conception of history. Or, at any rate, you have to develop an argument as to why the speeches are, despite appearances, actually scientific or actually acceptable. Alternatively, you can see Thucydides as a different kind of historian, of someone who is not like us. Now that sometimes can be a positive thing. There are various writers in the 19th century who see Thucydides as a good model precisely because he offers different ideas of what history should be all about. But it can also be a negative one. It's very easy for Thucydides to be seen as simply an ancient historian, someone whose work shows the differences between ancient and modern, and therefore someone whose work confirms why modern history is superior. So that's one tradition of reading. Thucydides as some sort of historian, Thucydides' work as some sort of history, however it is then understood and evaluated. There's a quite separate tradition which sees Thucydides as a completely different sort of writer. That is to say, which sees him as a political theorist, as someone who is not interested in information about the past as an end in itself, but someone who wants to look to the past as a source of data in order to develop general theories about human society, human politics, how people interact with one another. Now, this approach begins most obviously back in the 16th century, above all with the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who translated Thucydides. It's then been especially prominent in the last century or so, above all in the United States. The tradition of realism in international relations theory takes Thucydides as its founding text. It looks to Thucydides as the first realist, the first person who wasn't just interested in developing theories about international relations, how states interact with one another, but actually developed this specific theory. There's also been a tendency not just to look to Thucydides as a theorist, but to try and make use of his ideas in understanding contemporary events. So after the Second World War, it was quite conventional in the United States to understand the Cold War in terms of the Peloponnesian War. The confrontation with the Soviet Union was seen as mirrored or anticipated in the conflict of Athens and Sparta. And interestingly, even at the end of the Cold War, Thucydides continued to be important. Suddenly, Thucydides was read not as showing a great bipolar conflict, but as actually showing a world in which there are lots of different states interacting with one another, a sort of notion of international anarchy. So Thucydides remains an authority, or continues to be seen as an authority, despite the fact that the circumstances in which he seemed to be a good authority have actually changed. Now, most obviously, this approach to Thucydides draws on the early chapters of Book 1. The notion that he sets out there that he will be able, by studying the past, by giving people knowledge of events, this will then help them understand events in future. So that particular phrase, kata to anthropinon, according to the human thing, is understood as meaning that Thucydides believed in a universal human nature and therefore believed that you could study events and develop universal laws of human relations. Very often this tradition of reading Thucydides is based solely on reading the Melian dialogue. It's worth emphasising that a lot of the political theorists do not read all of Thucydides, or indeed do not read very much of Thucydides at all. They look to a small number of speeches, and they tend to assume that this is Thucydides speaking, not his characters. So that's a second great tradition, Thucydides the political theorist. And I would stress that these two, Thucydides as historian, Thucydides as political theorist, are just the two major traditions, the most prominent in the world today. I could, if I had more time, also talk about the role of Thucydides in military education, especially in the United States, his role in what you might term state propaganda, particularly the way that his words are used on war memorials. And then there's the role of Thucydides in wider culture, the way that certain poets and writers look to his work and make use of it, and the place of Thucydides on the internet. Often, it's just isolated quotations. It's not an extensive discussion of Thucydides, it's a few little bits taken from his work and understood as embodying timeless wisdom. What does all this mean? What are the consequences of the reception of Thucydides? Now, I think it's an interesting subject in itself. I mean, I am an ancient historian. I'm interested in the continuing influence of antiquity in the modern world, the fact that people are still interested, the fact that the Greeks and Romans are still felt to be important. But in the case of Thucydides, I think this continuing influence actually matters. It makes a difference. The ancient world is understood in modern political terms, or certainly this ancient writer is understood in modern political terms, and these modern interpretations of Thucydides then influence our own understanding of the past. So the way we understand Athenian democracy, for example, is certainly shaped by readings of Thucydides, but today those readings of Thucydides are shaped by the political tradition, a particular set of ideas about what kind of a writer Thucydides was, then shapes our understanding of what he wrote. So quite simply, if we understand Athenian democracy using Thucydides as if he's an utterly reliable source of information, we're going to come to a very different idea than if we read Thucydides as a political analyst, as someone who is not just giving us data, but is developing his own theory about the way that Athenian democracy worked. What do we do about this? Well, it's actually quite difficult. It's certainly not enough for us as ancient historians and classicists simply to claim expertise or to claim Thucydides, to say he is an ancient writer, therefore our interpretation is superior. I would say, as an ancient historian, it's quite easy to point out problems with some of the political readings. As I said before, many of them do not read the whole of Thucydides, they just look to the speeches and they believe that this is Thucydides himself speaking. Now that's obviously wrong, and if that's what you believe, then your understanding of Thucydides is going to be, I would say, impoverished. At the same time, I think there are some serious criticisms that can be made of the historical tradition from a political perspective, that thinking of Thucydides just as someone who provides data is equally misleading. It's always worth keeping in mind the wonderful line which Nicole Laureau produced. Thucydides is not a colleague. He's not a colleague of us as historians, he's not a colleague of the political theorists either. And each of us criticising the other for reading Thucydides in their terms kind of misses the point. What's important is to understand why Thucydides is seen in this way. How is it that these different, almost contradictory traditions of understanding his work have developed? How is it that his work is open to these very different forms of interpretation, these very different notions of what Thucydides means? We need to recognise how far our own interpretations are equally partial, are equally shaped by our contemporary interests and preoccupations. And we need, I think, to have a very clear sense of the power of these ideas of Thucydides. The way in which, regardless of the fact that these ideas are confused and contradictory, nevertheless, Thucydides continues to be seen as a powerful authority, someone whose ideas must be taken very seriously, not just in thinking about the past, but in making sense of our contemporary world.